Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
As a theater artist, as somebody who works in a medium that is about creative expression as a means to illumination and revelation, I really believe that there is power in thinking about stories from our own lives, as well as diving into the stories and narratives we have in a new way to create a new understanding and to live in a more enlightened manner. So as we think about this challenging narrative, this Akedah, this difficult and fraught story, I'm going to ask us today to engage in an act of creative investigation. And I'll give a few different entry points to do so. So first is, let's take what is a very common view of this story, which is a positive one, right? This idea that in order to make room for something greater in his own life, Abraham had to be willing to sacrifice, to give up that which he loved. He had to be willing to say goodbye to something in order to say hello to something else, even if it was unfulfilled. And so I would like to invite us to think about the stories from our own lives where we needed to let go of something in order to make room for something else, something larger, more important, more for the greater good. And these stories could be a little intangible, meaning I remember when I had to let go of this idea of myself that was keeping me safe or keeping me feeling secure in order to be open to something more, right? I had to stop thinking I was weak or stop thinking I was strong, stop thinking I had knowledge, stop thinking that I had no knowledge. Whatever it may be, I had to surrender who I was in order to become something else. That's one kind of story of sacrifice or saying goodbye to that which I held dear. Another might be connected to things that are more tangible, right? I had to be willing to say goodbye to this home, to this family, to this job, to this career, in order to make room for greater possibility, or in order to allow for that which I was seeing was more important. We have many of these stories in our lives. So I invite you now to take just a moment to think about the times in your life when you were willing to give up something for the sake of something more. And go ahead and just make a note of it, you know, either in your mind's eye, or you can even put pen to paper if you want and say, I have a story around that. Great. Now, another way to think about sacrifice is about this moment right now. We're in a moment in our society, of course, of not just the pandemic, but also of reckoning around racial justice and equity in our world. And so I invite you to think about that which you might be willing to give up in order to allow for that which is possible, in order to allow for greater justice or greater healing. What privileges do you hold close? What keeps you in a certain position that you might need to be willing to say goodbye to or hold on to less tightly in order to allow for our society to grow? And maybe this prompt doesn't speak to you, and that's okay. But if it does, think about what that might mean in your own life. And this could even have, you know, I've spoken about the pandemic and about justice, but this might also even have ecological ramifications in order to bring about the possibility of a healed world around our climate crisis, for example. What might I be willing to give up, say goodbye to, lessen in my own life, be willing to let go of in order to allow for this world to achieve its greatest potential in a way. Some of these might be small acts. Some of these might be very large. What are those for you? You might have a list. You might have a single one coming to mind. I invite you now to take a moment to write down a few, or in your mind's eye, think of a few that apply to you. Now, if we had more time together, if this were an hour-long workshop, I would do next what I often do in my theatrical workshops, which I would invite people to write these stories, to either write the story of this past, this time I had to say goodbye to something, or to write the story of now, reflection on what it might look like to let go, to sacrifice something I hold dear for something else, to have space. So as you work on your own, you might want to write about this. And remember, when you write stories from your past, it all lives in the details. Where were you? Who was there? What were your feelings? What were the sights and smells and sounds? And if you're writing a story of a reflection of the future, it's just about being open. It's about saying, what am I really feeling? What's going on in my gut and in my heart and in my head? And also, details do help too. What's the world you might imagine coming out of these changes, these things you're willing to let go of? And maybe describe that world. What do you envision for the future? So that's one way to think about this challenging narrative. Another way is I'm going to actually invite us to participate in a kind of theatrical imagination of this story. So at one point in the narrative, God basically says to Abraham, you know, now that I know that you fear me, we can X, Y, Z. And this is after Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son. And especially at this moment in time, what is it to have power, desire fear from you? Fear as a motivator for surrender, or for listening to that power, or for being willing to do what that power asks of you. And I wonder if this story can allow us a way in to imagine what it might look like to hit back against, to say no, to ask questions of that power connected to why they need you to fear them. And so let's imagine this moment before Abraham was willing to do this sacrifice. The moment maybe before he was willing to bring Isaac up that mountain, when he first got the news of what was expected of him in some ways. How might Abraham have challenged God? What might he have said? Maybe he could have said something like, well, why should I do this? If you are all powerful, why do you need me to prove that I fear you? He might have said, if something needs me to prove that I am afraid or in great awe of it, then it's not worthy of that awe or that fear. Or it might say, Abraham might have said, I think love is greater than fear. And so actually I'm going to show my devotion to you by actually standing up against your demand or your question or your request. And I'm going to do something else. And in doing so, I am demonstrating my humanity. I am demonstrating my willingness to be a part of this thing that you created and to hold it sacred. He could have made all sorts of arguments. And so if this were a theatrical workshop, I would say to you now, I would like you to write Abraham's argument. What argument might he make to God against fear, against the action being asked of him? And remember that when we write a monologue, often people don't start with the end. They don't start with making their great point. They try other tactics. Sometimes they start with other arguments. Well, I can do something else for you. I could do this, right? They try and they try to bargain, or they try to deny. Wait, maybe I'm misunderstanding. Are you sure that's what you're asking for, right? They try all sorts of tactics, and when those tactics don't work, that's often when they make the real point, the kinds of points I was just talking about really arguing against what is being asked of them and the principles underneath it. So I would invite you on your own to go ahead and imagine Abraham's argument. And a trick for writing this kind of thing is write a first line and then skip 2 pages and write a last line. And imagine, how does Abraham get from that first line to that last line? How does this argument unfold? And maybe by the end, Abraham's won. You flip the story on its head and the sacrifice isn't even going to be attempted. Or maybe Abraham, by the end of this monologue, has come to a new realization, a new understanding of what's being asked of him and why it's of value. And out of this monologue, my hope is that you might come to not only understand the story more, but maybe understand yourself and your relationship to questions of power and fear in this world, because Abraham merely becomes a vessel for your thoughts, your arguments, your questions, especially at this moment in time in our society when we are really dealing with issues of power and fear and asking, when do we stand up against that power? And when do we surrender to the requests or the demands being made of us? And these are difficult questions to deal with. And sometimes this kind of creative endeavor, inspired by our tradition, can help us understand this moment. So it's been an honor to be with you during this time. I hope this little mini reflection on using storytelling and dialogue as a way into understanding ourselves and our world was helpful. And again, such a pleasure to be a part of this with you. Thank you.